Joining me is filmmaker Ali Tabrizi and chief economist at the Menzies Research Centre, Nico Liu. Ali, today we saw a nationwide protest in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. They claim to be about standing for humanity, standing for Palestine, but you don't see any one of them holding posters of the hostages. Isn't that a bit hypocritical?
Of course it is. I mean, not everyone that goes out into the streets and protests has the answer. And unfortunately, what's really sad to see is that none of them have been calling for exactly the thing that would end this in 5 seconds flat, that would help alleviate the suffering of people in Israel, but also in Gaza. And that is to release the hostages and also for Hamas to surrender. Until they do those things, this is going to proliferate. And so what I'd like to see is this message going out on every single sign, on every single loudspeaker there is. But unfortunately, it isn't, which makes you kind of question the motivations of those protesting.
Exactly. Nico, what do you make of the protests we've seen around the country?
Well, I think there's plenty of well-meaning people there who think they know what they're there for, but the organisers and the professional protesters are there. They're people that were protesting, organising protests on October 8th while there were still Hamas terrorists in Israel committing a terrorist attack. And these people are they're not pro-Palestinian, they're anti-Israel and they're anti-Australian and they're anti-Western, and they're trying to disguise that by making it about anti-war, but it's about a lot more than that.
100%. Well, Labor held its Economic Talk Fest in Canberra this week, and safe to say, not much came from it. Productivity Commission Chair Danielle Wood said the outcomes from the roundtable were not actually enough to repair the country's sluggish productivity. Nico, are you surprised by this at all?
Well, no, I'm not. The only thing that the government's actually announced so far out of the roundtable was freezing the National Construction Code, which was a policy the Coalition took to the election and Labor opposed. I'm sure that they're cooking up a lot of things, so we'll have to wait and see. But really, at the moment, Australia's big problem is that we're spending a lot more than we're bringing in revenue. A lot of people would say that means the government's got a spending problem, but Labor, I'm sure, thinks that means they've got a revenue problem. And we saw some good things this week with the government moving to rein in the NDIS, but I think the great risk is that that's the only thing that they will do, and then they'll keep pointing to that every time they want to raise taxes.
And also energy. Energy is the biggest input into everything, and Matt Canavan made this point at Sky News' Real Economic Roundtable, which is if you're going to talk about productivity, you have to talk about energy. Ali, I want to bring you in on this one, because finally we're seeing some common sense up in Queensland. The LNP has decided it will disendorse Albanese's net zero emissions target. You were an environmental activist. You produced a world famous documentary on the environment called Seaspiracy that people can watch on Netflix. What do you make of the left's, obsession with this net zero goal, even though Australia is such a tiny percentage of global emissions?
Well, look, I'm still an environmentalist in a sense that I love the environment. I think we all agree that we want clean air, healthy oceans, flourishing rivers, biodiversity that's going up, forests that are teeming with life. We can all agree with that. Unfortunately, when it comes to things like net zero, it's so ideologically thick that a lot of people don't really know what it means. It's being measured in all kinds of weird ways. Countries are exporting their emissions to other countries to artificially look like they've lowered their emissions. And one of the things that's been common for me and a habit in my work is to point out when the emperor is wearing no clothes. And in my movie Seaspiracy on Netflix, we exposed things like the plastic straw movement, how ineffective it was and how it was more performative than actually helping anything, and was completely distracting from all kinds of tangible solutions, and devastation was going on elsewhere. So whenever I hear things like net zero, I just get instantly skeptical that this is another emperor's new clothes moment. And look, people get angry at me for that. They want me to go along with whatever the government or the United Nations say we have to do to save the planet, achieve sustainability, achieve net zero, except from those things are really ill-defined. No one can tell you how it's being measured. And for me, I think, look, we should be focusing on the tangible solutions and wake up from this ideologically thick approach to the environment. And unfortunately, people within the environmental space are starting to wake up to it as well.
Exactly. Well, one of the points I made in my editorial last week was that 3.2 million people a year are dying from household pollution because they don't have access to cheap energy. So instead, they're having to use things like kerosene, burning wood, biomass, and then they have poor ventilation. So they inhale this stuff. They often go blind as well. So if you actually care about human life, then wouldn't we want more cheap, clean energy like coal or gas that can actually help these people not die or get blindness from household pollution?
Sure, and look, this is a huge problem in countries like India and other countries where we've had a sort of communist regime where people have been going out there chopping down the forest in order to cook their food with. And so whether it's nuclear or other things, we need a sensible conversation about how we power our lives because everything hinges on it. And something like net zero, for me, it hasn't been a helpful conversation because all that it seems to be about is sacrificing an entire nation's economy on the altar of solar panels and just wishing for the best. And when it comes to things like energy, if we lose out on the ability to power our homes and cool our homes down and heat our homes up, you're talking about mass casualties across the board, especially in the developed world. When I thought the whole reason for this is to stop the impending collapse and extinction of human beings. At least that's what you hear from Extinction Rebellion anyway. So if we want human flourishing, we need a sensible conversation, not an ideologically thick one that is really nested in a lot of Marxism.
Totally. Well, Nico, I want to move to the issue of immigration now. The latest immigration numbers are showing that about one person is migrating to Australia every 49 seconds. We have also hundreds of thousands of international students in the country. And this was despite Labor kind of conceding that the coalition was correct in wanting to bring migration down to sustainable levels. How do we wean Australia and really the government off this obsession with mass migration and high international student numbers when it's clearly coming at the cost of housing affordability, rental availability and cost of living?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the things that a lot of people missed at the election was that cutting international student numbers was basically the only bipartisan issue of the entire election campaign. And the government, I think, said all the right things about cutting international students, but then when push came to shove, hasn't actually done anything about it. They've set a cap that was basically entirely meaningless, especially for the elite group of 8 universities in the cities where housing's the biggest problem. And then this year, they've gone and increased it by tens of thousands of more students. So they're saying the right things, but they're not actually doing anything. And there's no way that we can address the housing crisis that we have without both building more homes and having fewer people come in through immigration, and at the moment we're doing neither.
And I think one of the things people don't realise is that our international student numbers are not normal. We have, I think it's the highest per capita rate of international students in Australia, and you can make all the economic arguments, what about the higher education industry, but also what about the student experience on campus? I just graduated from Sydney University. And I can tell you, it really impacts your experience when you essentially have the campus dividing into, I know this sounds bad, but really ethnic groups.
Yeah, exactly right. We've got the highest number of international students in the developed world, and our universities have become completely addicted to them. And it seems that most of our vice-chancellors, particularly at the elite universities, seem to think that their job is to run an export business to bring in international students, not an educational institution to deliver a good education to Australian students. And these are publicly funded institutions that should be putting domestic students first. And it's impossible to have a realistic debate about it in this country because every time you say anything to do with international students, the vice-chancellors act as though it's the end of the world and the universities are all going to fall over. You look at what happened during the election campaign. The coalition proposed increasing visa prices by a few $1,000s. The universities screamed bloody murder. And then this week they've all increased the price of their degrees by tens of thousands of dollars. So basically, their arguments don't stack up and it's hurting Australian students.
So true. Well, Nico Liu and Ali Tabrizi, thank you so much for joining us this evening. You guys are fantastic.